You've turned on Sexy Marriage Radio, where the best sex happens in the marriage bed. Here's your host, Dr. Corey Allen.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Sexy Marriage Radio, where we're having honest, straightforward, anything goes as far as topics we're willing to cover, conversations about married life and sex, the good, the bad, the ugly, the successes, the failures, anything and everything in between. That's what we want to cover because we know we all live it, we all experience it, but yet we want married sex to be the hotbed for sex because we do believe it's sacred and it's blessed and it can just be fantastic for everybody that's doing it. If you want to let us know what you think of the show or any kind of questions you may have that we can address or topics, 214-702-9565 is how you can get a hold of us. You can also email feedback@sexymarriageradio.com. And then once again, I ask the Sexy Marriage Nation, if you like what you hear, jump on iTunes and leave a comment and a review. It helps us climb the charts in the sexuality category where there's a lot of anything goes information, and we want to be very marriage focused and pro relationships. So we want to spread that word as far as we can. And what I'm excited about with today's episode is throughout the history of the times I've been doing Sexy Marriage Radio and reading for different guests that are going to be on, or just reading for my own education and learning, my guest today is the name I kept kind of coming across, mentioned in several different books. And so today, Dr. Lori Brotto is joining me, and just a little bit about who she is. She is a professor in the Department of she's an OBGYN in the University of British Columbia. I'm going to fumble the words obstetric and gynecology and all that. I'll let her handle that. But she's also a clinical psychologist, and what she focuses in is in the world of mindfulness when it comes to life and particularly in sex. And so, Lori, I have to say thank you for joining us on the show today.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here.
And so, what else? Is there something else? I mean, because I know we were talking a little bit off the air before we started about your role as a professor allows you to do a lot of research. And this, I made the comment that mindfulness is not something we've done as a topic on Sexy Marriage Radio. And so I'm going to be sitting along learning just as well. And your quick reply was, I'm learning it too. But what else did I miss about kind of your journey into this specialty? Because that's a fascinating niche that you're going after. And so I'm curious about how you landed there.
Yeah, great question. So I started out actually always with an interest in research and started knocking on doors at the university where I was doing my undergraduate degree, really looking for any opportunity that anyone would bestow upon me to volunteer in any way. And the only professor that was willing to take on such a young 18-year-old student at the time was actually someone who I didn't realize it at the time, but he studied animal models of sexual dysfunction. Okay. So I basically spent the next 6 years of my life, so throughout all of my 4 years of undergrad and 2 years of my master's, studying animal behavior and various kinds of stressors, both physical stressors and more psychological stressors that we would minister to the rats, and then studying what happened to their sexual function, right? So did they lose interest when a mate, a hormonally primed mate was in the tube with them, or did they have an increase in mounting and darting and hopping, all behaviors that are indicative of sexual desire? And I really enjoyed that work because in that environment, it's a really controlled environment, right? You can control the dosage of medications. Yep. You can look at animals' brains and get a lot of information about what's really happening in the brain. And then close to the end of my master's degree was a pivotal year. It was the year that Viagra was approved in men. Okay. And so finally, scads of men, 20% of the male population who experience erectile dysfunction suddenly had a very candid and discreet and very effective way of addressing their sexual concerns, which was, a watershed moment in the field of not only sex research, but sex therapy as well. And then a few months after Viagra's approval, there was a landmark study that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And in this particular study, it was based on several thousand Americans across ages. And it essentially asked people, over the last year, have you had a period of a few months or more where you had a significant sexual concern? And they asked about desire and arousal, orgasm, etc. And the numbers were impressive. So at least 20 to 30% of men said yes. 2 to 3 months or more, I've had an issue. And for women, the numbers were even higher. So the study found that at least 40% of women, and it really didn't matter their age, experienced a significant sexual health concern. So that then got me interested in, well, what sorts of treatments are available for women, given the high number of women who have these concerns. And when I turned to the literature, my search was very, very quick because there was almost nothing.
Because there's not much there, right?
Very, very little. No approved medications. That's changed now. And in the way of more psychosocial or psychological interventions, very, very little had been published on what works and how well does it work. So that sort of took my career in a different direction. I didn't think I was going to be a sex researcher at that time, but suddenly realized that I had to, that this was such an important finding that, and then of course it begged the question, well, why are sexual concerns so high? What's happening that 30 to 40% of men and women are having these ongoing issues? And that's been about 15 years ago now. And so my research career has focused exclusively on understanding sexual difficulties and developing psychological interventions to address them.
Okay, and that's fantastic because it seems like the way the world has gone is let's throw a pill at it. Let's throw a medication at it that's not necessarily, it might reap some benefits. And I think that, I can't speak for you, but if you're a similar vein that I am, that it's a resource, absolutely, but it's not a fix.
Yeah, that's true. And, when Viagra was approved in men, it really started a very intense race. And it was the race to find the, quote, female Viagra.
Right.
And so there were many billions of dollars invested by a variety of drug companies to really find the magic pill. In 2015, the United States FDA did approve a medication to treat low desire in women. The data are really, really poor. It marginally improves low desire in women. About 30% of them have side effects such as falling asleep or feeling dizzy, and it's totally contraindicated with alcohol. And I've been known a person or two to enjoy a glass of wine to get them in the mood. So
exactly.
Completely contraindicated is a real barrier for a lot of women.
Absolutely. Okay, so through all of this, what I've kind of come across to associate with you is this idea of, and it's even the title of your book, of better sex through mindfulness. Mm-hmm. And so mindfulness is something that you would be better off trying to educate the audience real quick as far as the Sexy Marriage Nation of what are we talking about? And then how does this fit with the journey you've been and where you are now?
Great. So mindfulness, which has become very, very popular in kind of contemporary society, it can be defined quite simply as paying attention non-judgmentally, moment by moment. So we can take a look at the conversation you and I are having right now, right? Yep. We're both paying attention. We're listening to one another's words, but we're also orienting in a certain way. So I might be judging myself and how I'm saying certain things, but a mindful approach would be, I notice a judgment, let it go and come back to the present moment.
Okay.
And it has a really long, rich history through Buddhist meditation. Contemporary mindfulness is quite is different in a way. It sort of has evolved from meditation, but it's not religious. It really is a way of paying attention and being kind to yourself. So in the course of doing my research, and fast forward a few years from the early kind of period of time I shared with you, I was at the University of Washington in Seattle, doing some research with cancer survivors, very interested in survivorship issues around sexuality. And many of the women that I was working with and doing research with had described just a fundamental disconnection with their body. So not feeling their bodies anymore after their radical hysterectomies or after their radiation therapies. Lots of negative self-judgment. How will a partner perceive my body now that I'm sort of disfigured in this way? Dealing with mood and anxiety. And so the women really described even going through the motions of sex, but really not being there. And if they were there, it was like this voice from the back of the room or hovering over top, layering on all the judgments on top of them.
Okay.
So I had been introduced to mindfulness through a completely different clinical group at the University of Washington who was using mindfulness as a treatment for people who were having suicidal tendencies. And the idea there through dialectical behavior therapy is, some of the suffering is when we think that the suffering is never going to end, or we kind of rehash stories from the past. But if we can teach people to be right there and kind of ride out the suffering like you're on a surfboard, suddenly we realize that it's tolerable. And that was a really compelling kind of analogy in learning about that through clients with borderline personality disorder, that I thought, wow, there's a lot of similarities in what the women with the cancer survivors were sharing with me.
Okay.
So it was really an experiment. And tried it from there with a few women who allowed me to teach them how to do this. I, of course, was learning about it myself at the time. And then there was enough feedback from the women that, wow, I actually noticed response in a way that I thought I was incapable of feeling anymore. And so they were very, very motivated to learn this method of reconnecting with their bodies.
Okay. And that's interesting. And I think to me, what jumps out most and maybe is the most difficult when you're talking about how do I start to implement mindfulness into my life, and then for sure into my sex life, because our sexuality and our sexual past, typically we got quite a bit of baggage. We got things that have gone on, successes, failures, some of the stuff that's out of our control, and some of it's our own choices or that we were proud of or we're not. But the part to me that jumps out is that idea of how do I do this without the judgment? How do I feel it? How do I experience it? And I try to let go of the judgment of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think we live in a judgmental culture, and we're critical of things, right? We sort things into piles of things we like and things we don't like.
Yep.
And often that extends to our own bodies and our own sexuality. And women, for a multitude of reasons, tend to be more judgmental than men are. And in particular, they're more judgmental of themselves. So they might be worrying, let's say in a sexual encounter, what's going to happen if I don't respond well?
Right.
Is a partner going to leave me if I don't have an orgasm? So there's a lot of kind of jumping forward and catastrophizing about this imagined, feared, worst outcome. And inevitably what it ends up doing is it kind of short circuits the really important feedback response from the brain to the body. The brain tells the body to respond. And then when the body starts responding, the brain picks up those messages and tells the body to keep responding.
Right.
And when you're not there, when you're judgmental of yourself or fixated on the outcome, that communication between brain and body is simply not happening. And we've got lots and lots of evidence from different experimental studies that show that indeed can impair sexual response and sexual desire.
Okay, so that's basically what you're talking about, where you have the disconnectedness that can happen.
Yeah,
where I've just kind of checked out, and maybe I've gone to fantasy world, or maybe I've gone to to-do list, or reading the latest headlines in my mind, or something. Anything but being where I am.
Yeah, and I think the point that you're making is that sometimes the places that we go to are those negative and judgmental places. And sometimes it's just the benign routine to-do list,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
What am I making for dinner? How are the kids? Did we sign that, the permission form for the kids' soccer teams? And in the end, they all kind of work in the same way to disconnect us from the
Okay.
present moment.
So it's not necessarily if it's really laced with negativity. It's just the fact that I'm not in the moment. That's what starts to disrupt that feedback loop in a negative way.
That's right. And then what happens is when you are disconnected and your body does respond less, then you might start to worry about the lack of response. So then it inevitably does go to a more judgmental
right.
place.
So that's a vicious cycle. I mean, that's the depressed cycle where I feel bad, so I hole up, and then the fact that I hole up, I feel even worse. Because it just kind of gets this dark, wet blanket on me. Yeah. And what's interesting to me is because I think of the dynamic of what happens between a couple in the midst of sex when one person inevitably, because I can't think of the reality where a sexual encounter, if it lasts any length of time, where there's not going to be each partner disconnecting to some varying degree throughout the encounter, right? Just because it's hard to stay in the flow.
Yeah.
And then, so to me, it's the goal is, and I think this is probably where you're heading, the goal is recognize my disconnect and then bring myself back.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you pointed that out because I often get people who will say to me, I can't do mindfulness. I just have a busy mind. I've tried it and my mind takes off. And my response to them is always, fantastic that your mind takes off. This is great.
Yep.
Because in that moment that you recognize that your mind has taken off and you reel it back in, that's a moment of mindfulness. And so it's not a matter of emptying the mind of thoughts, right? It's not mindlessness, it's mindfulness. And so whether your mind takes off 5 times or 5 dozen or 5,000 times, it's our ability to notice it, pull it back. That's really where the muscle of mindfulness comes in.
Okay. And then can this happen on a couple level too? Because my hunch would be where you're in the middle of a sexual encounter or any kind of a conversation and you recognize your partner is disengaged and you say, hey, where'd you go? Yeah. And that's almost a call back to, hey, join me again. Hey, come back here to this conversation, come back to bed, come whatever it is, where physically nothing's changed, but emotionally something did.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure maybe many of your listeners have had that experience where you're having a conversation with someone and all of a sudden you have that blank gaze in their eyes and you can tell that they've disconnected and gone, right? And maybe it was just a fleeting moment of taking off. Well, the same thing can happen during sexual activity and you don't have to have your eyes open to notice when a partner has taken off. Maybe they stop responding. Maybe they sort of, tense up. And so in the book, Better Sex Through Mindfulness, I describe a number of exercises that couples can do together. And that is actually one of the tools we recommend is checking in with one another. How does this feel? Where are you? Are you with me? That sort of really important dialogue that's not only key for kind of improving the kind of sexual response and touching that happens, but it can be really sexy too, to be checking in. How does this feel? This feels fantastic. Keep doing this.
Okay. And that's what's interesting to me because what jumps to my mind with this, Lori, is the way in which I check in can help determine what happens. Because if I'm tentative with my checking in, that's almost a disconnect of me not being engaged in the moment because I'm seeking and too caught up in what might be the response as opposed to I'm trying to be mindful just like I'm trying to get my spouse to be mindful. Yeah. And so the way I do it probably has less threat and more actual engagement.
Yeah. And that's why many others also really advocate for kind of having a personal practice of doing this, outside of the bedroom on your own. So you can work through some of those issues around, how do I pull my mind back? How do I actually deal with negative self-judgments? Okay. How do I deal with being distracted by sounds outside the room? And then bring that into the sexual context.
Okay. And that's good. So what are some other things? Because I can just already hear somebody's listening in the Sexy Marriage Nation and they're, you know what? I see the benefit of this, but I'm totally a novice. I have no idea. This is
Yeah.
the first time hearing of it. How have
Yeah.
I not known this? Right. So
Yeah.
what are some simple practices? Because you're talking
Yeah.
about this almost starts individually, and then I
Yes.
bring it
Yeah.
to my relationship. So what are some simple things people can do?
Yeah. So I'll describe one exercise that a person can do on their own, and then I'll describe another one
Perfect.
that couples can do together. So one exercise to do on your own. And again, I have to emphasize this isn't just a light switch that suddenly you
Right.
understand what mindfulness is and you suddenly become a mindful, compassionate, Zen-like person. It takes practice.
Right.
And just like, I mentioned, it's the muscle of mindfulness, and just like exercising the muscles of our body, it requires effort and time and commitment and dedication, all of those things. So one exercise that people can do entirely on their own is, first of all, carve out the time to do this. So finding a place, and it doesn't have to be a quiet place, but it does need to be time where you've dedicated, all right, I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes actually engaging in this mindfulness practice.
Okay.
So I really like eating mindfulness practices because it's something that is so tangible for us. So
Right.
what you might decide to do is carve out the first 10 minutes of your meal, or maybe just an appetizer, where with every bite before you put the morsel of food into your mouth, you actually spend a few seconds looking at the food, not describing it, but rather describing it from the perspective of textures
Right.
and shape and colors and backsplashes of light. And then you bring it to your nose and you spend a few seconds just smelling it, and close your eyes and notice the aroma and notice what happens in your body as you smell. And then you put it into your mouth without chewing, with your eyes still closed, and you notice, wow, when food is in my mouth, my body has this immediate reflexive
Right.
salivary response without me even chewing.
Yep.
Super powerful example of the brain-body connection. And then over the course of chewing, and again, we're talking about one morsel of food in your mouth.
Absolutely.
So you're really taking the eating experience and you're drawing it out over several minutes.
Yes.
And what you're doing in the process is you're connecting with all the sensations that are emerging in that moment. And when you do that, different parts of the brain fire in different ways. So you've got the perceptual centers, you've got the thinking centers, the emotion centers, the centers of your brain that tell you what to do next. So I love the eating meditation, especially for anyone who's never tried this before.
Yeah. I can already envision a restaurant and seeing just seeing people like, hey, wait, they're having a totally different experience with their meal than I am with mine. If you're practicing this, because it truly is a taking in of the moment and the experience. Because I've even heard, this is where I came across this first, was a company called Precision Nutrition, where one of their habits was take 10 minutes to eat 10 raisins.
Right.
And
that's exactly right.
You know, whether you shove them all in and chew it up and then sit for 10 minutes, or you learn how to do it slowly over the 10 minutes, the goal is to experience it. And that's exactly what you're describing, is to just savor all of what you're doing and feel it.
Yeah, exactly. So now if we take that kind of that notion of paying attention, noticing sensations, resisting the temptation to jump ahead, and we apply it to a couple, one exercise that has been around for a very, very long time, I certainly cannot take any credit for it whatsoever, is Sense8 Focus.
Okay.
And it's a really powerful couple exercise where one person touches the other person head to toe for about 15 minutes. And the first time we do this, there's no breast and there's no genital touch. And the goal of the person who's receiving the touch, by the way, that person is completely undressed, typically lying down, maybe a bed, maybe the floor. The goal of the person receiving the touch is to tune in.
Yep.
So what do I actually feel in my body as I'm receiving touch from my partner? And noticing, is there a temptation to jump ahead and, want to move on to something sexual? And the instructions are very, very strict. This is not foreplay. This is not sexual activity. This is a way of touching one another where you tune in. So you continue that for about 15 minutes. And then the two members of the couple swap. So now the giver is the receiver, the receiver is the giver. And the goal is exactly the same. It's an opportunity to really tune into sensations. And couples will inevitably say that they've discovered something so new in doing the Sense8 Focus exercise, even if they've been together for decades.
Right.
Right. So once that kind of necessity of moving on to sex is removed, it suddenly frees up a lot of mental space to just focus on sensations. And it
Right.
feels really good when you do that.
Right. Because then you start to experience the world between and before sex, because how often does it happen in a married couple's life where maybe they were dating and they had the religious backing or just a choice of, you know what, we're saving this for marriage.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden it's open to you, and that's all you want to do at the beginning.
Right.
And that's perfect because you're both usually on that same page, but then typically that shifts as you get further into it. And one person's like, everything is always about sex with you. And the other one's like, yeah, it is. So how do we, I don't know anything different. And so now you're talking about there's a whole lot different to that. And then that seems to me to set the stage for now you can blend all of that to when you get into the whole touch, that you're experiencing all of it. And the body can kind of recalibrate everything.
Yeah. Yeah. And, especially for couples that have been together a very, very long time, where things can become more routine and monotonous and desire inevitably might decline, and you introduce kids into the situation and stress. So Sense8 Focus is a great way to make touching novel again.
Okay.
We also know that with aging that our sensitivity on our skin changes. So what might have felt good years ago might not feel the same way, or you might have new erogenous zones on your body that you and a partner are not aware of. So really, really powerful exercise that I really have described and conceptualized as a purely mindfulness exercise.
Okay.
Because that's what we're doing. We're paying attention non-judgmentally, moment by moment.
Right. And that's the whole, so that seems like that's, when you're talking about it on a Sense8 Focus level, that it's both of you have the challenge in the presence of each other to let go of judgment, because how easy is it to, I'm focusing on what I'm focusing, but then I notice my spouse is shifting or adjusting. Now I start judging me, and am I doing it right, or her? Is she not enjoying this right? And so this is truly, how do we learn and challenge to confront all of that in real time and let it go and stay engaged, and then see where we can then follow that connection as it unfolds.
Yeah. And where it unfolds and where it takes you to is in marvelous places that many people never thought were possible before, again, because we become so fixated on a quick fix.
Right.
And we also, we're influenced by societal and media messages that sex needs to be quick and automatic, and it needs to be multi-orgasmic. And so we're sort of bombarded with these media messages around only one way to experience healthy and satisfying sex, and it's unfortunate because when we really pay attention, even in a long-term relationship, there's so many different ways to feel pleasure. Yeah,
absolutely. And it seems to me that's as unique as the people involved.
Right.
That you get